Sometimes, when the arthritis in my hands flares up during these long, gray winters, I find myself reaching for a phantom dial, my fingers twitching in the rhythm of a code that has been obsolete for half a century. The doctors tell me it is just the nerves misfiring, the decay of the body. But I know better. It is the muscle memory of the desert. It is the ghost of Hakeim trying to send one last message through the static of my decaying mind. I remember the heat first, not the polite, sun-drenched warmth of the university library in Libyan, where the dust motes danced in lazy spirals over treatises on Cartesian dualism, and the smell of old paper was a comfort. No, this was a malevolent, physical weight. The Libyan sun did not just shine. It pressed down upon us, turning our dugout into a kiln. The air inside that sandbagged tomb tasted of hot metal, ozone, and the unwashed bodies of men who had forgotten the feeling of clean sheets. I was 22, though in the mirror of my memory, the face that stares back looks simultaneously like a child's and a corpse's. I was supposed to be finishing my degree, debating the nature of existence in a cafe by the Rhone. Instead, I was sitting on an ammunition crate, staring at the glowing filaments of vacuum tubes, trying to impose order on a chaotic universe. They called me the professor in the unit, a mockery that I accepted with the same stoicism I applied to the dysentery and the flies. I approached the radio the way I had approached my studies, with a desperate, rigid analytical focus. If I could just understand the variables, the atmospheric interference, the frequency drift, the tenuous connection of the copper wire, then perhaps I could keep the horror at bay. I wiped a layer of fine, talcum-like dust from the faceplate of the transceiver. It was a ritual, a prayer to the god of electromagnetism. The rag came away brown and gritty. Everything was brown. The sand got into the water, the food, the creases of our skin, and the delicate internals of the machinery. I terrified myself with the thought of a single grain of silica lodging between the contact points of the Morse key, severing the circuit. That was my fear, not the Germans. The Germans were an abstract concept, a force of nature like the wind or the heat. My true enemy was the silence. In Libyan, silence was a luxury. It was the space between thoughts, the respectful hush before a lecture began. Here, silence was an accusation. It meant the line was cut. It meant a patrol was dead. It meant I had failed. I would sit for hours, headphones pressing my ears against my skull, listening to the atmospheric wash, the cosmic background noise of the universe. It sounded like bacon frying in a distant room. I had to sift through that frying sound, picking out the rhythmic chirps of humanity. ... A heartbeat, a scream in binary. The afternoon was stretching out, warping under the heat. The generator outside hummed a low, monotonous note, a mechanical ohm that vibrated through the soles of my boots. I was monitoring the divisional frequency, waiting for the scheduled check-in from the southern perimeter. It was late. My eyes drifted to the notebook open on my knee, where I had been trying to translate the chaotic reality of the last week into a letter home that I knew would never be sent. I looked at the words and felt a wave of nausea. The lie was too large to swallow. Then, a sound in the headset. Not the check-in. It was faint, a ghost in the machine, buried under layers of static and the magnetic interference of the sun. I pressed the ear cups tighter, closing my eyes to shut out the sight of the sandbags, the sweat dripping from my nose, the rusted tin of beef on the floor. I became nothing but an ear. The signal was drifting, undulating like a wave. It wasn't standard military cadence. It was frantic, slurred, a hand shaking on the key. The signal dissolved into a wash of white noise. My heart hammered against my ribs, a erratic counter-rhythm to the steady hum of the generator. I reached for the tuning dial, my fingers trembling slightly. I forced them to still, I told myself. I adjusted the gain, leaning forward until my nose was inches from the dials, smelling the burning dust on the tubes. I needed to catch the tail of that transmission. Was it a friendly outpost being overrun? A deception, or just the ionosphere playing tricks on a tired student? I tapped out a query, the sharp clack-clack-clack of the key sounding obscenely loud in the small space. Nothing but the hiss of the empty desert. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. I checked the connections. I checked the battery leads. Everything was nominal. The logic held, but the reality was slipping away. I felt the panic rising in my throat, the irrational certainty that I had missed the one piece of information that could save us, that my failure to filter the static was a moral failing equal to treason. And then the world ended. It didn't begin with a sound. It began with a pressure wave that sucked the air out of the dugout, compressing my lungs until I thought they would burst. Then came the upheaval. The ground simply ceased to be solid. The sandbagged wall to my left disintegrated, showering me with heavy, suffocating earth. I was thrown from the crate, the headset ripped from my head, the wires snapping. I hit the dirt floor hard, tasting copper and grit. For a moment there was no sound at all, just a high-pitched ringing, pure and piercing, like a silver needle being driven into my brain. I lay in the dust, gasping for air that was thick with pulverized rock. The silence I had feared was total now. I was deaf. I was blind. I was cut off. I scrambled to my knees, clawing at the sand that covered the equipment table. My hands found the metal casing of the radio. It was hot, but not from operation. I fumbled for the headset, putting it back over my ringing ears. Then, no static, no hum, no frying bacon, just the absolute terrifying void. The shell had landed close, deafeningly close, and in the violence of its arrival, it had severed the umbilical cord. I was alone in the dark, a scholar of dead languages, shouting into a void that refused to answer. The paralysis lasted only seconds, though in the warped time of the shock, it felt like an epoch. The ringing in my ears began to recede, replaced by a sensation of the earth trembling, a rhythmic shuddering that traveled up through my knees and into my spine. The bombardment had begun. This was no longer the ordinary world of waiting and anxiety. We had crossed a threshold, the theoretical war. The war of maps and logistics and philosophical debates about liberty had been incinerated. In its place was the beast itself. I scrambled under the table, my hands moving before my mind could catch up. The explosion had shaken the power coupling loose from the rear of the transceiver. It was a simple mechanical failure, a problem of physics, not metaphysics. I could fix this. I had to fix this. My fingers, slippery with sweat and dust, grasped the heavy cable. The metal threads were stripped, the casing cracked. I forced the connection, jamming the plug back into the socket and twisting the locking ring with a savage strength I didn't know I possessed. The pilot light on the front panel flickered, died, and then glowed a steady, reassuring amber. I pulled the headphones back on, and the universe rushed in. It was no longer the lonely static of the afternoon. It was a cacophony. The radio spectrum was screaming. Voices overlapped, cutting over one another in a frantic chorus of French, German, and Italian. I was back. I was the conduit. I grabbed a pencil, the wood snapping in my grip, and grabbed a fresh sheet of paper. My hand moved automatically, transcribing the chaos into neat, orderly lines of alphanumeric data. The fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. I was no longer Jean-Luc Mercier, student of history. I was a machine for processing information. The dugout shook violently as another salvo walked its way toward our position. Dust rained down from the timber roof, coating my shoulders like snow. I didn't look up. I was locked onto a voice from a forward observation post, a young corporal whose voice cracked with terror, but who kept reading out numbers. I keyed the microphone, my voice sounding strange and distant in my own ears. Received Baker 2-7. Relay to artillery. Stand by. I switched frequencies, my movements fluid. Practiced. I called the battery commander. I gave him the numbers. I was the bridge between the eyes that saw the death and the hands that could deal it. Seconds later, the ground jumped. Our own 75 guns were firing. I switched back to the observer's frequency, waiting. The silence this time was not empty. It was pregnant with violence. The corporal screamed, the distortion of the radio turning his voice into a jagged tear. A surge of electricity went through me, sharper than any shock from the equipment. I had done it. I had reached out across the desert with invisible hands and crushed a threat. For a fleeting heartbeat, the sensory overload, the smell of cordite now drifting in, the shaking earth. The heat coalesced into a feeling of immense, intoxicating power. I was not helpless. I was part of the organism. But the organism was being hunted. The sound changed. Beneath the rolling thunder of the artillery, a new noise emerged. It started as a low groan in the sky, a vibration that rattled the teeth in my jaw. It rose in pitch higher and higher, a mechanical scream that bypassed the ears and went straight to the primitive lizard brain that governs survival. Stugas, I hunched over the radio, instinctively trying to shield it with my body, as if my thin ribs could protect the vacuum tubes from a 500-pound bomb. The scream intensified, a tearing sound like the sky was being ripped in half. The air pressure in the dugout dropped again, a vacuum sucking at my eyes. I didn't hear the explosion. I felt it. It was a physical blow, a giant hand swatting the earth. The world turned upside down. The timber supports of the dugout entrance groaned and snapped with the sound of breaking bones. A wall of sand and darkness rushed in, burying the daylight. The amber light on the radio flickered. Outside, the generator sputtered. I could hear the engine coughing, choking on dust or shrapnel. It wheezed once, twice, and then died. The amber light faded to nothing. I was in total darkness. The weight of the sand pressed against my back. The air was instantly foul with dust. I reached out in the blackness, my fingers brushing the cold metal of the dead radio. There was no hum, no static, no voices. I was buried in the tomb of Hakeim, and the silence had returned to claim me. Panic is a fluid. It fills the spaces where reason used to be. In that suffocating dark, buried beneath tons of Libyan sand, the student in me tried to claw his way to the surface. He wanted to scream, to thrash against the timber supports that had snapped like dry twigs. He wanted to calculate the volume of oxygen remaining in this tomb and the probability of suffocation. But the soldier knew that calculation was a waste of breath. The soldier knew there was only one variable that mattered: the signal. I fumbled in the blackness, my knuckles grazing the rough wood of a crate until my fingers closed around cold iron. The emergency hand crank. The generator was dead, choked by dust, but the manual dynamo was still attached. I slotted the handle into the side of the casing. It turned with a rusted, grinding resistance. One revolution. Two. A tiny amber eye blinked open on the radio panel. It was faint, wavering like a dying star, but it was light. Thus began the longest lecture of my life. The subject was not philosophy or law, but endurance. The curriculum was pain. To transmit, I needed power. To get power, I had to crank. To receive, I had to listen through the static of a damaged receiver, while my own blood pounded in my ears. I became a machine. My left arm was the piston, rotating in a relentless, agonizing circle. My right hand was the voice, the fingers poised over the bakelite key. Time dissolved. There was no day or night in the whole, only the rhythm of the crank. Rotation, rotation, signal. I improvised an antenna from a spool of copper wire I found by feel, threading it through a fissure in the collapsed roof where a sliver of heat leaked in. I was blind, sweating until my uniform clung to me like a second skin, turning the handle until my shoulder joint felt like it was grinding glass. The messages came in fragments, whispered ghosts from the battle raging above. Supply requests, coordinate corrections, desperate pleas for medical evac. I took them all. I was the switchboard of hell. I relayed the coordinates for a drop of 75 shells. I confirmed the sector boundaries for the Foreign Legion. I heard the results in the thudding vibrations of the earth against my spine. Every time the ground shook, I knew I had done my job. I was the ghost in the machine, the invisible wire holding the defense of Hakeim together. By the second day, the student was dead. The boy who drank coffee in the squares of Libyan and debated the nature of free will had evaporated in the heat. There was no free will here. There was only the duty of the gear and the cog. My hand bled onto the crank handle, making it slick. I tore a strip from my shirt and bound it, gritting my teeth against the cramping muscles that threatened to lock my arm in a permanent spasm. 72 hours. I hallucinated in the dark. I saw the faces of my professors in the shadows, lecturing me on the futility of effort. I saw my mother setting a table for a dinner I would never eat. But I kept cranking. If I stopped, the amber light died. If the light died, the division was blind. And if the division was blind, we were all dead. Then came the message that stopped my heart. It chattered through the headphones, weak and distorted, cutting through my delirium. I wrote the numbers down in the dark, my handwriting a jagged scrawl on the pad. I knew those coordinates. I knew the map of Hakeim better than the lines on my own palm. The target zone was dangerously close. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was the transmission. For 3 days, I had been the only constant signal in a shifting sea of radio traffic. The German triangulation units were good. They were methodical. They would have narrowed down my origin point by now. A sustained transmission of this length, relaying a complex fire mission, would be the final piece of their puzzle. It would be a flare shot up from my grave, marking this exact pile of dirt for every Stuka and artillery battery in the Afrika Korps. I stopped cranking. The amber light faded, dimming to a dull red coal. Silence rushed in, heavy and seductive. I could just sit here. I could let the battery die. The retreat was happening anyway. If I stayed silent, they might overlook this collapsed dugout. I could wait for the British. I could wait for the end. I could live. The logic was sound. It was rational. It was the choice of a man who wanted to return to his books. But the silence was not empty. It was filled with the imaginary screams of the men retreating above my head. Men who would be cut down by tanks if the artillery didn't blind the enemy. I looked at the fading light. I looked at my trembling hand. I was not a student. I was a signalman of the 1st Free French Division. I grabbed the crank. I spun it. I put every ounce of my remaining strength into the rotation, forcing the amber eye to burn bright one last time. My right hand moved to the key. I didn't tremble. I tapped out the sequence. Distinct, clear, unafraid. I held the key down, sending the continuous tone to guide the shells. Painting the target, painting myself. The response was immediate. It didn't come through the headphones. It came through the earth. The world above disintegrated. The friendly artillery, guided by my hand, hammered the sector. The ground convulsed violently, tossing me against the wall of the dugout. Dirt poured down in a torrent. The roof supports groaned, finally giving way completely. The darkness became absolute. The air was squeezed from my lungs. I curled into a ball around the radio, shielding it even as the crushing weight of the desert settled over me. I didn't hear the silence return. I was already gone. Light, it was painful, searing white, burning through my eyelids. I tried to turn away, but I couldn't move. There was a pressure on my chest. Then the pressure lifted. A rush of air, hot and smelling of sulfur, filled my nose. I coughed a dry, hacking sound that tore at my throat. He's here. Merde, he's actually here. Hands. Rough, calloused hands grabbing my tunic, pulling me upward. I was dragged from the earth like a root being torn from the soil. I blinked, tears streaming down my face as the harsh African sun assaulted my eyes. I was on my knees, gasping, vomiting bile and dust. A face swam into view. It was Sergeant Lemaire. He was shouting something, his mouth moving wildly. But I heard nothing. The bombardment had shattered my eardrums. There was only a high-pitched ringing, a singular, unending note. He slapped my shoulder, grinning, pointing to the smoking wrecks of 3 Panzer tanks a few hundred meters away. Twisted metal carcasses burning in the sand. He pointed at the tanks, then he pointed at me. He mimed tapping a key. I looked at my hands. They were black with grease and dried blood, shaped into permanent claws. I tried to straighten my fingers, but they wouldn't obey. They were still holding the ghost of the crank, still tapping the ghost of the key. I survived. We retreated, we regrouped, and eventually, we won. I went back to France. I went back to the university. I sat in the lecture halls of the Sorbonne, listening to men in tweed jackets talk about logic and the structure of civilization. I took notes. I passed exams. but the student never really came back. I am an old man now. My house in Libyan is quiet, or it would be, if I allowed it. But I do not allow it. In the corner of my study, a radio plays constantly. Low, static-filled, a hum of voices and music that I never turn off. My wife, God rest her soul, used to beg for silence, but I could not give it to her. Silence is not peace. Silence is the moment before the connection breaks. Silence is the dugout. I look at the young people today, with their phones and their instant signals, their effortless connection. They do not know the weight of a wire. They do not know that civilization is a thin, fragile thing, maintained by the sheer will of people refusing to let the line go dead. I learned in the dark that we are not defined by what we think, but by what we transmit. When the roof collapses, when the air runs out, when the logic of the world fractures into chaos, you have a choice. You can curl up in the dark, or you can send the signal. The machine of my youth, the logic, the philosophy, the ordered life of a student was crushed in that hole. It never worked again. I could never trust the harvesting of wisdom from books, because I knew the harvest could be burned in an instant. All that remains is the connection, the hand reaching out in the dark. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.